In the brutal reality of naval combat during World War II, not every destroyer lived up to the promise of its blueprints. Some were triumphs of engineering, setting new standards for speed, firepower, and endurance. Others, however, entered service weighed down by flaws, design compromises, stability problems, or vulnerabilities that haunted their crews in battle. This series isn't about the celebrated successes, it's about the warships that exposed the limits of ambition and the dangers of chasing perfection in a world war. And no discussion of destroyer design begins without the Japanese Fubuki class. When they were launched in the late 1920s and early 1930s, these destroyers stunned the world. They were the first true super destroyers, designed to outgun and outrun anything else afloat. Their introduction changed naval warfare overnight. The Fubuki mounted enclosed dual-purpose 127mm 5-inch guns in turrets, a leap forward from the open mounts of earlier destroyers. Not only did these provide heavier firepower, they offered faster rates of fire and better crew protection. Even more revolutionary were their Type 93 long-lance torpedoes, unmatched in range, speed, and explosive power. No Allied destroyer of the early 1930s could come close. With these weapons, the Fubuki could shred enemy surface groups and even threaten capital ships. Add in a maximum speed approaching 35 knots, and Japan had created a destroyer that could keep pace with carriers, strike hard, and escape just as quickly. On paper, this was brilliance. In practice, the design came with a price. Those cutting-edge weapons, enclosed turrets, and long-range torpedoes all added weight. Early Fubukis suffered serious stability problems, earning a reputation as top-heavy. Several ships required extensive retrofitting after capsizing incidents in rough seas revealed just how dangerous their balance issues could be. Then came another flaw: anti-submarine warfare capacity. The Japanese Navy, focused on fleet battles, treated submarine hunting as an afterthought. The Fubuki carried only a handful of depth charges and lacked advanced sonar. Against the growing submarine threat in the Pacific, this was a crippling limitation. Space was another issue. As the war dragged on and new threats emerged, the cramped hulls of the Fubukis made it difficult to install the heavier anti-aircraft weapons and radar systems needed to keep pace with Allied innovation. Later subclasses corrected some of these problems, but the early Fubukis became less adaptable with each passing year. Still, their influence cannot be overstated. The Fubuki was the destroyer that forced the rest of the world to catch up. Admirals from London to Washington studied its design with alarm, knowing they had to match or risk falling behind. In many ways, the Fubuki was a triumph of imagination and a cautionary tale of what happens when innovation outruns practical limits. The Hunt class. If the Fubuki symbolized ambition taken to the edge, the British Hunt-class destroyers represented something very different: restraint and specialization. Designed not as fleet destroyers but as escort ships, their purpose was simple: protect the convoys that kept Britain alive. And while they excelled in that role, they came with trade-offs that left them badly exposed in other situations. From the start, the Hunt class lacked the heavy punch of its contemporaries. Instead of the 5-inch guns standard on fleet destroyers, it carried 4 4-inch main guns. Lighter weapons better suited to harassing aircraft or small surface raiders than trading blows with enemy destroyers. Even more glaring was the absence of torpedo tubes. In a war where torpedo attacks often decided battles, this omission meant the Hunt could never threaten major surface units the way other destroyers could. In terms of speed, the Hunts were deliberately capped at about 28 knots. That was fast enough to shadow convoys and chase down submarines, but far too slow to operate with the fleet or disengage from faster enemies. This limited speed, however, came with a benefit: stability. The Hunt's compact hull and conservative design gave it outstanding handling. particularly in the stormy waters of the North Atlantic. Crews came to trust the ship's ability to ride out rough seas and maintain a steady gunnery platform, even when conditions were brutal. Where the Hunt class truly shined was anti-submarine warfare. Equipped with sonar and a solid load of depth charges, these ships were tailored to track and destroy U-boats stalking Allied convoys. Their smaller size and nimble handling made them effective submarine hunters, and many German submariners came to respect them as deadly opponents. But all this came at a cost: limited versatility. The Hunt class was a specialist ship. Outside of convoy defense, its light armament and lack of torpedoes made it a poor fit for major fleet actions or independent operations. Fuel range was also modest, just over 2,300 nautical miles, tying them to relatively local escort duties rather than long-range patrols. As warfare evolved, their small hulls left little room for meaningful upgrades beyond a few additional anti-aircraft guns. In short, the Hunt class was a destroyer built for one job, and in that role it performed admirably. But the very features that made it excellent as an escort, stability, sonar, convoy defense, also left it irrelevant on the larger naval stage. The Soldati class. If the British Hunt destroyers were specialists built for survival, the Italian Soldati class destroyers chased something far more glamorous: speed and fire, with outdated fire control systems that made accurate long-range gunnery difficult. What seemed like a strong battery too often delivered disappointing results in combat. Their anti-aircraft defenses were even weaker, minimal at best, in an era when Allied aircraft increasingly dominated the seas. Torpedo armament was present, but it received less emphasis than in other navies, reflecting Italy's doctrine of surface gun battles rather than aggressive torpedo strikes. Where the Soldati stood out was speed. Depending on subclass, these destroyers could reach between 34 and 39 knots, fast enough to match or outrun most Allied destroyers. In theory, that meant they could dash in for a strike, evade superior forces, or race ahead of slower fleets. But speed came with a hidden cost: endurance. Their operational range was limited to about 2,200 nautical miles at 14 knots, a crippling weakness in extended campaigns. In the confined Mediterranean, this was manageable, but outside those waters, the Soldati were prisoners of their own fuel tanks. Then there was the question of stability and seaworthiness. The Soldati's sleek, slender hulls looked fast, and they were, but they handled poorly in rough seas. Top-heavy structures and narrow beams made them unstable, especially once wartime upgrades added extra anti-aircraft guns. In heavy weather, they were difficult to fight effectively, and crews often found themselves battling the ship as much as the enemy. Anti-submarine warfare was another blind spot. Italy's naval doctrine placed little emphasis on submarine defense, and the Soldati reflected that attitude. Equipped with only a handful of depth charges and limited sonar, they were nearly useless in ASW. This left them dangerously exposed when escorting convoys or operating without heavier support. Finally, adaptability was limited. The cramped interiors left little room for future upgrades, and their instability meant adding more weapons could actually worsen performance. By the middle of the war, many Soldati-class destroyers were already sliding into obsolescence, their speed no longer enough to offset their fragility. In short, the Soldati looked sleek, dangerous, and fast, but beneath that elegant design lay serious flaws. They could sprint, but they couldn't last. The Mogador class. If Italy's Soldati destroyers were fragile sprinters, the French Mogador class destroyers were something else entirely. Oversized experiments that blurred the line between destroyer and cruiser. On paper, they were terrifying. In practice, they revealed just how dangerous it could be when naval designers overreached. The Mogador carried an imposing armament of 8 138mm guns in 4 twin turrets. This was heavier firepower than most Allied cruisers, let alone destroyers. In theory, it gave the Mogador class overwhelming surface punch against fast-moving aircraft, and even limiting their utility in quick destroyer duels. Add in unreliable fire control systems, and what looked like devastating armament often underperformed in real combat. Their anti-aircraft defenses were even weaker. Despite their massive size, Mogadors entered service with minimal AA weapons, an oversight that grew fatal once the skies filled with dive bombers and torpedo planes. Anti-submarine warfare was nearly non-existent, with little more than a token depth charge load and no proper sonar. Against underwater threats, they were blind. But the Mogador's most famous feature wasn't its guns. It was its speed. These ships could exceed 43 knots, making them among the fastest destroyers of the entire war. That kind of velocity made them capable of outrunning almost any enemy vessel. Yet here again, the trade-offs were brutal. Their operational range was less than 2,000 nautical miles at 15 knots, meaning their fuel tanks ran dry long before they could make a difference in extended operations. Then came their Achilles heel: stability. Despite their enormous size, the Mogador class suffered from severe handling problems. Their tall superstructures and insufficient ballast made them nothing notoriously unstable in heavy seas. At high speed, they became dangerously difficult to control, undermining both gunnery accuracy and crew confidence. Worse still, the design left little room for upgrades. With so much displacement already consumed by their massive gun batteries, there was neither the weight capacity nor the stability margin to add the anti-aircraft or sonar systems desperately needed as the war advanced. By 1940, what had once seemed like revolutionary giants already looked outdated and dangerously specialized. The Mogador class stands today as a case study in ambition gone wrong. Ships that promised everything but delivered instability, poor survivability, and almost no adaptability. Were the Mogadors brilliant super-destroyers, or just oversized mistakes waiting to sink? The Narvik class. Germany's Narvik-class destroyers, officially known as the Type 1936A, were destroyers in name but heavyweights in design. They carried some of the largest guns ever mounted on ships of their type, 150mm main guns, giving them a level of firepower closer to light cruisers. On paper, this looked like an intimidating upgrade. In reality, it became the very flaw that defined the class. Those massive guns came with problems. They were slow-firing, mechanically complex, and unreliable, often jamming or misfiring at critical moments. Worse, the sheer weight of the turrets created serious stability issues. The Narviks were notoriously top-heavy, struggling in rough seas. Attack torpedo batteries were included, but again, without the flexibility or reliability of their counterparts in the Royal Navy or US Navy. Against submarines, the Narviks were even worse. Equipped with only basic hydrophones and a small stock of depth charges, they were ill-suited for the submarine war that defined the Battle of the Atlantic. Performance at sea also failed to live up to expectations. On paper, the Narvik class could reach 36 knots, but in practice, their unreliable propulsion systems made such speeds rare. Mechanical failures were constant, and fuel efficiency was dreadful. Their range was often limited to less than 2,000 nautical miles, cutting short their operational endurance and leaving them dependent on frequent refueling. For a navy already struggling with supply lines, This was a crippling weakness. Upgrades? Almost impossible. The Narviks were already pushing the limits of their hull design. Their unstable platforms left little room to add extra anti-aircraft weapons or advanced sonar without worsening balance. By the midpoint of the war, they were badly outclassed, their size and guns looking impressive on paper but delivering little in real combat. The Narvik-class destroyers were, in many ways, a mirror of Germany's broader naval strategy. Ambitious, intimidating, but riddled with flaws. They were heavy destroyers that tried to do too much and, in doing so, ended up doing little well. So what were they really? Fearsome heavy destroyers or overbuilt failures? Comment your judgment.